Although the parish is in the middle of a message series called Needy, the readings we just heard are specifically intended for the scrutinies of those who are to be baptized at the Easter Vigil. The elect, for those who are being baptized, this is a time of purification and enlightenment. It is a time to recognize those areas in their own lives that need to be changed by the power of Jesus. Our gospel today speaks about conversion and transformation of heart, which Jesus brings. Now, this process of conversion is not restricted only to the elect, but it should be a time of conversion for us as well during this Lenten season. So I invite you that we need to pay close attention to the words of God today and allow that word of Jesus to transform our hearts and our lives. A popular song when I was growing up as a child was entitled, "Don't Fence Me In." How many remember that? You're showing your age. Yeah. Part of the lyrics go like this: "Give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't fence me in. Let me ride through the wide open country that I love. Don't fence me in." Now, there's nothing religious about that song. But the title fits our gospel reading today. In fact, that's what Jesus was telling the world of his time. Don't fence me in. Now, Jesus was traveling from the Jewish province of Judea, which is in the south, to the northern province of Galilee, which is in the north. And in between these two provinces was the territory of Samaria, with the region of the Samaritans. It was the shortest distance to travel from Judea to Galilee to go right through Samaria. But we all know that the Jews and Samaritans hated each other. They disliked each other. So much so that most Jews would take the longer route from Judea, and they would cross the Jordan River and go up onto the north to Galilee, avoiding the Samaritan territory altogether. But not Jesus. He would not go around the problem that was created by fear and hate. His journey brought him to Jacob's well, and there he stopped to rest while his disciples went to buy food at the nearby village. And as he waited, a Samaritan woman came to the well to draw water. But that simple encounter led to a conversation in which Jesus broke down 4 major barriers that divide the human family. The first barrier was the racial barrier. As I mentioned, the Jews and Samaritans resented each other. That resentment began in the 18th century before Christ. The Assyrians conquered the 10 northern tribes and forced them into exile. And those exiled Jews intermarried with other Jews with non-Jews from other lands, and that mixing of races produced the people called Samaritans. Most Jews saw Samaritans as half-breeds, as an inferior race, and Samaritans despised the Jews for them thinking that way. So it's no wonder that the Samaritan woman was surprised when Jesus, a Jewish man, asked her for a drink of water. She said, "How can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" That was a fact of life in those days. These two groups disliked each other. They were separated by a wall of disrespect and mistrust that had been there for centuries. But Jesus walked right through that ancient barrier. He looked at the woman, and when he looked at the woman, he didn't see a member of an inferior race. He saw a person made in the image of God. You see, with Jesus, the only race that mattered was the human race. All people belonged to it, and every one of them mattered to God. That's why Jesus passed through Samaria. And you and I must make a choice to follow him. We can either have our racial resentments or we can have Christ. But we can't have both. The two cannot coexist together. Jesus broke down the barrier of racial prejudice and renewed the woman's image as a child of God. Another barrier Jesus broke through was social in nature. When the disciples returned to the well and saw Jesus talking with the woman, they were surprised and even shocked. They belonged to a male-dominated society in which women were second-class citizens. No man would ever be seen talking to a woman in public, especially a strange woman and a foreigner at that. But once again, that didn't matter to Jesus. He was a man and a Jew, and he knew the rules of his society. But his highest loyalty belonged to the kingdom of God. And in the kingdom, there was no class distinction. All people stand on equal ground in God's kingdom. Each person is just as important as every other person in the eyes of God. That's how Jesus lived. He shared some of his highest spiritual insights with the woman because for him, there was no such thing as a second-class citizen. Jesus broke down the fence of social distinction and refreshed the woman's life with dignity. The third barrier he broke down was moral in nature. The Samaritan woman came to draw the water at noontime, it says. Now, most women did that in the early morning when it was cooler during the day. It was also a time where the women gathered to socialize and to visit each other. But this woman came at a time when she was sure that no one would be at the well. You see, she had a reputation. She had 5 failed marriages, and she was presently living with a man out of wedlock. Everyone in the town knew this and treated her accordingly. Can you imagine the gossip that went around that town? So she learned to avoid rejection by avoiding the other women. This set the stage for Jesus to break down the barrier of moral judgment. Jesus treated the woman with the same respect that he would treat his own mother. He was aware of her reputation, but he simply refused to single her out from the rest of humanity. You see, in his eyes, all people had 3 things in common. We all have 3 things in common. First, they were made in the image of God. Secondly, that image was tarnished by sin in some way. And third, God loved all people in spite of their sinfulness. If we accept these 3 truths, then we have no right to erect moral barriers between ourselves and other people. Oh, it's easy to point the finger. Oh, look at this. It's easy to be the moral judge of everybody. I'm saying when we point the finger, look what's happened. There's 3 fingers pointing back at us. As followers of Christ, we should try to live a high moral standard, where we must never forget the fact that we too are sinners and are in need of God's mercy. Jesus broke down the fence of moral judgment and quenched the woman's thirst for God's grace and mercy. And Jesus left behind one other broken barrier, and that was labeled religion. The Jews worshiped God in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, after the death of King Solomon, the kingdom was divided, and the northern tribes built their own temple to worship in. So the question was, which was the proper place to worship? But Jesus dismissed that dispute when he said, "An hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither in spirit, neither on this mountain or in Jerusalem. The hour is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. In other words, no one has an exclusive claim on God. When people worship God in spirit and truth, their worship is acceptable to God. Religion should be one of those things that brings people together. Instead, it has been one of the most divisive forces in human history. That's because we all insist that our mountain or our temple is the right place or the only place to worship. And Jesus broke down that barrier, but we people keep building it up. For Jesus, the important thing was not where we worship, but how we worship. God seeks those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. Jesus passed through Samaria not because it was the shortest distance, not because it was convenient, but out of conviction. He saw the barriers that divided the human family, and he was determined to break them down. To every attempt of racism, social distinction, moral judgment, or religious labeling, Jesus quietly but firmly said, "Don't fence me in." Jesus can give us the same freedom if we allow him to enter into our hearts and to change us in some way. He is the living water that renews our lives and frees us from all that divides the human family.